Hey, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Populist Patriot. Hope you all had a great weekend, and we're going to be I guess, tomorrow, another work week. And looking forward to another great weekend coming up. Actually, my weekend is going to start Thursday night and continue through Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, of course, crowning it with Father's Day. So, looking forward to another great weekend, and it had an enjoyable weekend today. I wanted to talk about the Arab oil embargo of 1973. And a very interesting article I came across. And this is in the Washington Post issue of June 23rd, 1978. And the article's author is or was Bernard D. Nossiter. And the title says, Magazine says Moscow urged Arab and oil embargo of 1973 all the way back in 1967. And apparently, an Arab magazine named Ad Dastur, which is an Arab language weekly that was printed in London and apparently obtained an unofficial but near verbatim minutes of a meeting from Abdul Majid Farid, who is a former aide of President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. And he was then, and by 1978, was a key aide to Prime Minister Houari Boumediene of Algeria, another pro-Soviet socialist dictatorship at the time. And apparently, this meeting took place in Moscow on July 17th, 1967, where Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin told the chiefs of Algeria and Iraq that Arab oil could, quote, split the ranks of the imperialists, close quote, and, quote, create great political problems for the United States and its allies. He urged them to set up an oil subcommittee of foreign ministers to study the tactic. Apparently, neither Prime Minister Houari Boumediene of Algeria nor President Abdul Aref, who was the socialist, somewhat pro-Soviet dictator of Iraq before the Ba'athist Party took over in 1968 in Iraq, they didn't seem apparently that much interested, interestingly enough. They went to Moscow, representing the Arab states, to seek Soviet support for a continued war against, our freshly triumphant Israel, who won the Six-Day War against its Arab enemies. However, the seeds that the Soviet government placed in suggesting and pushing an Arab oil embargo actually came to fruition in 1973. And the Soviets gave at least heavy verbal and political support to the Arab efforts to embargo petroleum exports to the Western Europeans and the United States and other American allies. Let me just take a sip of my water here. So Kosygin actually stated, I have recently learned that an Arab foreign ministers conference will soon be held. I wish this conference would set up a subcommittee on oil, try to split the ranks of the imperialists on the oil question by supporting one country against another, and follow the same policy on economic concessions, presumably concessions to exploit oil for America and the West and Arab countries. Well, what does this mean? You can create, I guess, also, Kosygin says you can create great political problems for them and you can make great use of these problems. It's unfortunate that your current thinking is restricted to one topic. Will the war go on or stall? So, I mean, I can go on and on. So, what does this all mean? It shows that when a country or a block of countries, which may even have their own energy supplies, all in the name of free trade ideology, as well as starting in the 1950s, trying to import oil from Asian and Middle Eastern countries in an effort to try and foist them into the Western orbit, is not necessarily a foolproof plan, because these countries will go against Western interests. A coup may happen, a revolution. Look what happened with Iran, for example. And boom, it goes from largely an ally of American interests in most cases to that of a lead anti-American power in the Middle East. So the lesson is that with the Soviet transcript as described by Ad Dastor, it shows that the Soviets are going to use energy or economic interdependence with nations to its advantage and to the disadvantage of the United States. And it just makes me think that the famed classical liberal globalists who many conservatives love, they like salivate over, Frederic Bastiat, who was a French so-called economist and also was a politician, I believe. And he famously said that if goods don't cross borders, armies will. And this is why the free market people are wrong. The free market people, along with the liberal internationalist globalists, have given us energy interdependence. Why? Because they feel, well, the free market people feel that we can get energy cheap. Well, good luck with that. And the liberal internationalists feel that we can create this global village, of course, supported by major corporations that want to, tap those oil deposits in the Middle East and elsewhere, and create an America, a Middle East and Asia and other oil producers that are supposedly going to be allied with the United States. Well, this just shows that free trade is lunacy. It shows that free market economics is lunacy. And reading these minutes of a Soviet strategy meeting with fellow Arab allies from Iraq and Algeria just proves this case. It's another penny in the jar on the failure of free market economics. Goods don't cross borders, army will. Bullshit. That's bullshit. That's a crock of shit. Okay. We're going to be using some harsh language on this show because the free market people and free market globalism and free market deregulation and withdrawal of the state from creating sound and strong national economies, that has failed the United States. It has failed American strategy. So it is high time that it needs to be replaced. And I know, once again, I'm probably going to get Republican and conservative and libertarian, free market. Oh, Nevin, you come out of your shell, you're a statist, you're a socialist. I don't care. I want the survival in the United States. It ain't coming with laissez-faire liberal economics. It's crock of shit and everything else. And who has given us, let's do a little segue. I mean, the energy independence, started little by little in the 1950s. We started to really import oil from countries in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, not a particularly Western-friendly country, I might add, and other countries, even like Indonesia under Sukarno, who was rapidly at the time becoming a pro-Soviet socialist dictator, and other countries that were allied to the United States. And this was described in some detail in a book by a real good Republican on many issues, many economic issues on trade and immigration, Senator George Malone of Nevada. He was a Republican senator decades ago. And he wrote a book called Mainline. And he talks about how the United States started to sacrifice its energy independence on the altar of, quote, building geopolitical alliances. But there was also an ideological perspective too, as well. Starting under the Reagan administration, there was, according to Anthony Horrigan, who was one of my favorite old school conservative columnists, he used to write for the Spartanburg Herald Journal. He had written that action to ensure energy independence is bitterly opposed by free trade purists. And during this time, also during the early start of the first term of the Reagan administration, also had a deal with the Saudis between the United States where we would basically provide tremendous amounts of grain and wheat in exchange for Saudi oil. So, you have that economic interdependence. And I think it was the secretary, one of our cabinet secretaries, Block, it might have been, I think he's the agricultural secretary under Reagan, was saying that, we have a comparative advantage on grain and wheat production and growing. And the Saudis had a, quote, supposed comparative advantage on the drilling and extraction of oil, which is not necessarily true. The United States certainly long has had a comparative advantage, yes, or capabilities certainly of producing grain as well as oil. So this is why the free trade purist is just crap. It's just ideology to masquerade misguided geopolitical decisions, as well as also corporate greed. I mean, and Milton Friedman, yes, he's back. Of course, I'm going to mention him. He's a horrible economist, and I know I'm going to piss off all you libertarians, but that's okay. He said in his book, Free to Choose, quote, "It's far cheaper to stockpile oil than it is to maintain in existence oil wells that costs a great deal more to exploit than you can buy the oil from abroad. In any event, it always seems to be kind of a mystery how you preserve the oil reserves in the United States by pumping it out as fast as possible." No, Friedman. Okay, Friedman, why you won a Nobel Prize in economics is just freaking beyond me. But it's a whole question of strategic sense. Milton Friedman's assertion here lacks strategic sense because, the Free to Choose was written after the Arab oil embargo, and the United States suffered the inflation in good large part because of the shocks resulting as a result of the Arab oil embargo. Our dependence on Arab oil cost us dearly. And it really spurred on even more the inflation, which hit us hard in stagflation in the late 1970s. And that allowed people like Milton Friedman and his gang and gaggle of free market economists and activists to unfortunately gain more credibility. And unfortunately, the American economic policy is not free of that type of ideology. And corporate governance is not free of that because Milton Friedman and Theodore Levitt and others were the ones who propounded the idea that companies only have a fiduciary responsibility only to the shareholders, really the majority shareholders. And a lot of good that has gotten us. So we need to produce our own oil. We should not be exporting oil before satisfying our home market. Once our home market is satisfied, then, in my opinion, we should then export oil and crude oil as well as petroleum products, or just petroleum products, gasoline, etc. That's just my opinion, at least. Of course, I'm reading from my book here. Friedman did not consider the strong possibility that in a war with the Soviet Union, Red Navy subs would torpedo American and other Allied tankers transporting oil from places far away from the U.S., like the Middle East and Africa. And, the free market crowd continued decades later. Simon Lester of the Cato Institute noted in 2013, energy independence should not be a policy goal, and energy interdependence actually makes us better off. Really? Arab oil embargo? That didn't work so well. And also some of the shocks resulting from the America's embargoing oil from the Russian Federation, which I agree with. Well, now American oil companies should be ordered by the U.S. government then to resource the oil from domestic deposits. That's what it should be, regardless of what it means to the majority shareholders in the major oil companies. David R. Henderson at the Foundation for Economic Education, I'd like to call it the Foundation for Economic Miseducation, noted in 2008, although the United States could achieve energy independence We could do so only at an enormous cost. Energy dependence is much cheaper and much more desirable. In fact, the case for being dependent on other countries for oil is the same as the case for being dependent on other countries for bananas and coffee. Well, no. Bananas and coffee do not naturally grow in the United States unless they're grown in greenhouses and special climate controlled environments. Other countries have climates that are conducive for growing bananas and coffee. Oil is something that could be sourced here in the United States. So there's no comparison. If we can produce it or extract it, then we should be able to satisfy our home market. I really don't see much of a middle ground there, especially on critical commodities like oil. And oil is a critical commodity. Bananas and coffee, not really. Even though I love bananas and coffee, it's not the same. It doesn't have the same critical importance as oil. Many liberal internationalists also oppose American energy independence. The former editor of the New Republic, Michael Kinsley, claimed it makes sense to use foreign oil today and hoard our own supplies. In 2001, the Brookings Institute noted economic security is not a function of how much energy a nation produces domestically or buys from abroad. A reprise of mercantilist practices would only lower American living standards. It is wasteful to insist on producing at home those commodities that can usually be supplied more cheaply from somewhere else. Funneling scarce resources into enterprises in which we no longer have a firm comparative advantage means leaving less capital and labor available to other industries, ones that could put those resources to better use. The result is that society is impoverished, not strengthened by the pursuit of self-sufficiency. Well, it's just nonsense. All these free market stuff. Listen to it very carefully. Does it make sense to you? Regardless of what the cult of classical liberal economics tells you to think, it is counterintuitive garbage. And if people like me ever took control in the United States, these ideas would be thrown right out into the curb. They would be totally discredited. And that's all I'll say about that. Because it's these individuals, these free market people, these corporate greedsters and liberal internationalists that have got us to the point where we are dependent on foreign nations, including geopolitical rivals and outright enemies, for important critical commodities as well as manufactured goods. And of course, as we read here earlier from that Washington Post article I was quoting from 1978, the Soviets were clearly seeking to take advantage of that. They were clearly wanting to take advantage of our growing dependence on imported oil from Arab countries to their advantage, to bring down the American imperialist camp. Big Energy also opposed national self-reliance on our domestic resources. ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson, who remember was appointed in that supposedly Make America Great cabinet and that supposedly Make America Great President Donald Trump, who I supported and voted for in 2016, by the way, primary as well as the general election. So Tillerson noted in a 2006 speech, unfortunately, many policymakers in the United States are advocating energy independence. Such a protectionist policy offers false hope for energy security. Only by fortifying and multiplying international energy partnerships can we protect against shocks. And here President Reagan and his administration's opposition to tariffs on imported oil was based on an adherence to free trade orthodoxy. As a result, by the end of 1986, the United States imported 23% more crude oil than the previous year. And the Soviets sought to, as I mentioned earlier in this live stream, sought to exploit this interdependence with potentially hostile or countries or unstable regions of the world for importing critical commodities like oil. And they sought to exploit that to their advantage. In a 1973 meeting with the communist Somali dictator General Siad Barre, Leonid Brezhnev outlined the Soviet strategy to exploit American dependence on third world raw materials and energy sources. Brezhnev said, "Our aim is to gain control of the two great treasure houses on which the West depends: the energy treasure house of the Persian Gulf and minerals treasure house of Central and Southern Africa." Soviet atomic bomb scientist Andrei Sakharov recalled how a high official of the Soviet Council of Ministers spoke about Moscow's long-range strategy of exploiting um, Arab nationalism in order to create difficulties for the European countries in obtaining crude oil and thereby to gain influence over them. The Arab oil embargo in 1973 was viewed by the Soviets and Chinese as a positive step in denying the resources needed to sustain Western and American economies. El Sedin noted in the Soviet publication International Affairs, the oil weapon is a powerful weapon in the hands of the Arab countries. This is the first time in the history of the Middle East that the Western world has been made to feel who the real owner of Arab oil is. Let us add that the Western powers depend heavily on Arab oil. An article in Pravda noted in 1973, to stop pumping Arabian Gulf oil in the present situation would be like an economic earthquake to the entire capitalist economy. In October 1977, Khmer Rouge controlled Radio Phnom Penh, and that was then communist Cambodia, noted that, quote, the oil producing countries have used oil as an effective weapon with which to strike at the big capitalist countries and especially U.S. imperialism. So there you go. And I think what we can finally see here is how there is a disconnect between an understanding of strategic economic policy and how international enemies use the short-sighted free market ideology against American and Western interests. There's a disconnect between free market ideology and strategically based economic policy in order to preserve national security of the United States. One is based on ideology and one is based on how the world actually works. Here's another one. While hailing the Arab embargo of 1973, oil embargo, as a, quote, weapon which dealt a telling blow at Zionism and its supporters, Chinese First Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping noted in 1974, it is entirely right and proper for the developing countries to terminate imperialist economic monopoly and plunder, sweep away these obstacles, and take all the necessary measures to protect their economic resources and other rights and interests. If imperialist monopolies can gang up to manipulate the markets at will, to the great detriment of the vital interests of the developing countries, why can't developing countries unite to break imperialist monopoly and defend their own economic rights and interests? The oil battle has broadened people's vision. What was done in the oil battle should and can be done in the case of other raw materials. So there you go. There you go. Again, do you all notice what our enemies say, what our geopolitical rivals say, and what a gaggle of corporate executives, liberal internationalists, and free market economists and free market, quote, think tanks that really don't do a lot of thinking, it seems, are saying? On the one side, you have short-sighted so-called economic ideology and corporate greed. And on the other side, you have Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and others looking at the situation saying, hey, look, we're going to exploit the short-sighted greed of the folks and the short-sighted greed and stupidity and myopic lack of thinking by the free market people, by the oil corporations, by American policymakers, and say, look, we have an opportunity to use this economic interdependence as a weapon to bring down imperialism, bring down the United States. So I'm going to make this statement, a very bold statement. In order to be a true and effective anti-communist, if you want to oppose the growth of socialist types of totalitarianism or collectivist totalitarianism that seeks the downfall of the United States, you have to oppose free market fundamentalism. You cannot be a good anti-communist and be a free market fundamentalist at the same time. You can't. And this live stream, in my opinion, proves it. So, a radical civic nationalist government, and that's my personal political ideology, it's a term I coined, will basically end our reliance on economic policy making council on economic policy by the free market crowd. We're going to end them. We're going to be thrown out of government. Larry Kudlow and Stephen Moore and others, these people will no longer be being given counsel to American presidents like they did, for example, on President Trump. They'll be gone. They'll be discredited. They might be in some little fringe Bob Jones-like university or something or another. That's probably where they'll be doing. They'll isolate it. They'll be marginalized. We will have a new a nationalized PBS and NPR that would be nationalized by the radical civic nationalist government. Will launch programs and counter propaganda against many, many different forces within the United States and outside the United States. And one of them is we will use the power of speech, the power of the microphone and the power of television and radio to basically neutralize the free market crowd that has really destroyed a lot of the capabilities of the United States. It's destroyed our culture. It's destroyed our economic policy, our economic power. And this is just evidence to show this. So just wanted to end this live stream on that note. I seem a little tired. I've had a tiring but great weekend. But I wanted to talk about this topic because I thought it was a very, very interesting historical article that I found in the Washington Post. And it just, another penny in the jar, shows that our enemies are seeking to exploit American weakness and the mess that the free market economists and the free market people, free market oriented presidents and energy corporations, etc. And, the weaknesses that have resulted from many of these misguided policies. So I thank you all for joining me for this live stream. I got a couple of more going. Got to get a refill on this water because my mouth is getting really dry. So I'll be on momentarily. Bye-bye.